In 1839, a man who called himself Jabari Mansa arrived in chains at a Charleston slave market after being captured in West Africa and transported across the Atlantic in conditions that killed nearly half the people who had boarded the ship with him. What made Jabari different from the thousands of other Africans who endured the Middle Passage was not his suffering, which was universal, but his identity before enslavement and what he represented to the American slave system. Jabari claimed to be the son of a powerful king in what is now modern-day Nigeria, a man who had been educated in both traditional African knowledge systems and in Arabic literacy through Muslim scholars, who spoke multiple languages, and who understood political organization and resistance in ways that terrified the slaveholders who encountered him. Over the next 7 years before his death in 1846, Jabari would organize 3 separate escape attempts involving over 200 enslaved people, would maintain written correspondence in Arabic with free black Muslims in northern cities, would teach literacy to hundreds of enslaved people in secret schools that operated beneath the awareness of white authorities, and would preserve African cultural practices and historical memory in ways that challenged every racist assumption about enslaved people being ignorant savages who benefited from enslavement. American authorities recognized Jabari as so dangerous that they attempted to suppress all records of his existence, destroyed documentation of his resistance activities, and created a deliberate historical silence around him that lasted for over 150 years. Before we recover the forbidden story of Jabari Mansa and understand why America tried so hard to erase him from history, hit that subscribe button right now, smash that notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we resurrect the stories that power tried to bury forever. Jabari Mansa was born around 1805 in the Yoruba kingdoms of what is now southwestern Nigeria, into a royal family that controlled significant territory and that had maintained power for generations through a combination of military strength, diplomatic skill, and control of trade routes that connected the interior of West Africa with coastal ports. His father, whose name was recorded in Arabic documents that Jabari later produced as Mansa Erimi, ruled over a confederation of several towns and villages, commanding the loyalty of thousands of people and maintaining a court that included scholars, warriors, traders, and religious leaders. Jabari's childhood and early adulthood were spent receiving the education appropriate to someone destined to potentially inherit authority, including training in warfare and diplomacy, instruction in the histories and traditions of his people, and study of Islam, which had been established in the region for centuries, and which provided access to literacy and to broader networks of learning that connected West Africa to the Arab world and beyond. By the time he reached his 30s, Jabari had traveled extensively within West Africa, had learned to read and write in Arabic, spoke Yoruba, and several other regional languages, and had participated in the complex political and economic life of a sophisticated society that European racism preferred to imagine as primitive and savage. The capture and enslavement of Jabari in 1838 was not the result of random raiding, but was the outcome of political conflict and betrayal that was endemic to West Africa during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. Competing kingdoms and factions within kingdoms made alliances with European slave traders, using them as weapons against enemies and as markets for prisoners of war and for people who had been enslaved through various legal and illegal means within African societies. Jabari's father had been involved in such conflicts, sometimes as a captor and seller of enslaved people, and sometimes as a victim of other groups' slave raiding. In 1838, a rival faction supported by European traders launched an attack on Mansa Erimi's territory, and during the chaos of battle and its aftermath, Jabari was captured along with dozens of others from his father's court and population. The captors recognized Jabari as valuable not just as labor, but as a symbolic victory over their enemies, and as someone whose knowledge and abilities would command high prices from slave traders. Jabari was marched in chains to the coast, a journey of several hundred miles that took weeks, and they killed many of the captured people through exhaustion, disease, and violence. At the coast, he was sold to Portuguese traders who specialized in transporting enslaved Africans to the Americas, and he was loaded onto a ship that would cross the Atlantic to Charleston, South Carolina. The Middle Passage voyage that Jabari endured in 1838-1839 was a horror that he would later describe in letters and in conversations that were recorded by people who knew him, providing one of the relatively rare first-hand African accounts of the Atlantic crossing. The ship was overcrowded with over 400 captured Africans packed into spaces that did not allow them to stand or move freely, chained in darkness, given minimal food and water, and subject to disease and violence that killed approximately 180 people during the 2-month voyage. Jabari survived through a combination of physical strength and psychological resilience, maintaining his sense of identity and purpose even in conditions designed to break human beings and reduce them to the docile property that slaveholders wanted. He observed everything about the ship's operation, about the crew's routines, about the navigation, and about the language that the Portuguese and American crew members spoke. He identified other Africans who shared languages or who seemed to possess leadership qualities or specialized knowledge. And he began planning resistance from the first days of the voyage, trying to organize a revolt that would allow the Africans to seize the ship and either sail it back to Africa or to a free port where they might escape. The revolt never materialized during the voyage, probably because the level of surveillance and the physical constraints made organized action impossible. But Jabari's instinct toward collective resistance and his ability to inspire and organize others would characterize everything he did during his 7 years of enslavement in America. The ship arrived in Charleston in January 1839, and Jabari was sold at auction along with the other survivors of the Middle Passage to various plantation owners and traders. He was purchased by a man named William Harrison, who owned a rice plantation about 40 miles outside Charleston, a brutal operation where hundreds of enslaved people worked in flooded fields in conditions that made rice cultivation among the deadliest forms of slavery in terms of mortality rates. Harrison recognized that Jabari was unusual. His bearing, his obvious intelligence, and his physical presence all suggested someone who had not been born into slavery and who had experienced authority and respect. But Harrison also believed that hard work and harsh discipline would break any enslaved person regardless of their previous status, and he assigned Jabari to field work under overseers who were instructed to show no special treatment and to punish any resistance immediately and severely. What Harrison did not anticipate was that Jabari's experience and education had prepared him to understand exactly how the plantation system worked, to identify its vulnerabilities, and to begin organizing resistance that would challenge Harrison's control and that would spread far beyond the boundaries of his plantation. Within months of arriving at Harrison's plantation, Jabari had established himself as a leader among the enslaved population, despite being a newcomer and despite speaking English poorly at first. He communicated with other Africans who had been captured recently and who spoke languages he knew or could learn. He observed the enslaved people who had been born in America and who knew how the system worked from long experience. He identified the informal leaders and the people who commanded respect and trust. And he began sharing knowledge about his own background, about resistance strategies, about literacy, and about maintaining African cultural practices and historical memory. Jabari taught people to read and write in Arabic, conducting secret classes at night in the slave quarters, where small groups would gather to learn a form of literacy that white overseers could not recognize, even if they observed it, because they assumed Arabic was just decorative marks rather than actual writing. He led religious observances that combined Islamic practices with traditional African spiritual elements, creating spaces where enslaved people could maintain identities that were not defined by their enslavement. And he began planning an escape attempt that would involve not just himself, but as many people as possible from the plantation and from neighboring properties. The first organized escape attempt that Jabari led occurred in August 1840, approximately 18 months after his arrival at Harrison's plantation. The plan was ambitious and demonstrated Jabari's strategic thinking and his ability to coordinate complex operations. Despite constant surveillance and despite lacking freedom of movement or communication, Jabari had made contact with enslaved people at 3 neighboring plantations through the networks that connected enslaved communities, despite white efforts to prevent such connections. He had identified a route north toward Virginia and eventually toward Pennsylvania that would take the group through terrain where they might avoid patrols and where they might find assistance from free black people and sympathetic whites. He had gathered supplies including food, tools that could serve as weapons, and maps that he had drawn based on information gathered from various sources. And he had trained approximately 80 people from the 4 plantations in coordinated movement, in defensive tactics if confronted, and in maintaining discipline during the escape. The escape was planned for late August, when the rice harvest would create maximum confusion, and when warm weather would make travel more survivable. The escape began on the night of August 22, 1840, when Jabari and the other leaders simultaneously led their groups away from their respective plantations toward a predetermined meeting point several miles away. The coordination worked initially. All 4 groups successfully left their plantations without immediate detection and assembled at the meeting point with approximately 80 people ready to move north. But the escape was discovered more quickly than Jabari had anticipated, probably because someone informed authorities or because the simultaneous absence of so many people could not be concealed until morning as planned. Armed patrols were mobilized within hours, and they pursued the escapees with dogs and with overwhelming force. The group managed to evade capture for 3 days, moving approximately 50 miles north during that time, but they were finally surrounded in a swamp where the terrain made further flight impossible. In the confrontation that followed, 6 enslaved people were killed by the patrols, 15 were seriously wounded, and the rest were captured and returned to their plantations. Jabari survived without serious injury, and he was identified by the patrols as the leader and organizer of the escape attempt. The punishment for Jabari's leadership of the failed escape was severe and was designed to break him and to make an example that would deter other enslaved people from similar attempts. He was whipped repeatedly over several days, receiving over 200 lashes that left his back permanently scarred. He was kept in chains for months, unable to move freely, and constantly monitored to prevent him from planning further resistance. He was sold to a different owner, a man named Thomas Beaumont, who owned a cotton plantation in the interior of South Carolina, and who had a reputation for brutal discipline and for breaking enslaved people who showed signs of independence or resistance. The sale separated Jabari from the community he had built at Harrison's plantation and placed him in a new environment where he would have to start over in building relationships and organizing resistance. But the punishment in the sale did not break Jabari or eliminate his commitment to freedom and resistance. If anything, the brutality of the response to his first escape attempt reinforced his understanding that the system could not be negotiated with or reformed, but had to be completely rejected and fought against. At Beaumont's plantation from late 1840 through 1843, Jabari continued his work of education and organization. Despite the increased surveillance, and despite the trauma of his failed escape and the punishment he had endured, he taught literacy in Arabic to dozens of enslaved people, creating a form of secret communication that could not be monitored by white authorities. He maintained correspondence with free black Muslims in northern cities, including New York and Philadelphia, using a network of literate enslaved people and free black sailors and traders to transport letters that were written in Arabic and that documented conditions of slavery and organized support for future escape attempts. Some of these letters survived and were later discovered by historians, providing rare documentation of enslaved people's resistance networks and of the connections between Islam and abolitionism that existed but that were deliberately suppressed from mainstream historical narratives. Jabari also continued teaching about African history and about his own background, preserving knowledge about African political systems, cultural practices, and resistance to slavery that challenged the racist narratives that portrayed Africans as primitive people who benefited from enslavement by being brought to Christian civilization. The second major escape attempt that Jabari organized occurred in June 1843 and involved even more people than the first attempt. APPROXIMATELY, 120 enslaved people from 6 different plantations, who had been recruited and prepared over more than a year of secret organizing. This attempt was better planned than the first, with Jabari and other leaders having learned from their previous failure about the importance of faster movement, about the need for diversionary tactics to confuse pursuers, and about the value of having safe houses and support networks established along the escape route. The attempt involved splitting into smaller groups that would travel different routes toward Virginia, with plans to reassemble at predetermined locations, and eventually to reach Pennsylvania, where they would be free. The escape began simultaneously at all 6 plantations on the night of June 15, 1843, and initially appeared to be succeeding as the groups scattered in different directions and evaded the patrols that were mobilized to pursue them. But again, the attempt was ultimately unsuccessful. Some groups were captured within days. Others made it further north, but were eventually tracked down. And a few individuals may have successfully escaped, though no definitive evidence exists. Jabari was captured after 10 days of flight and approximately 120 miles of travel, once again identified as a leader and organizer. The response to Jabari's second escape attempt was even more severe than after the first, reflecting growing recognition among South Carolina authorities that he was not just an ordinary resistant enslaved person, but was someone who posed a systematic threat to slavery's stability in the region. Jabari was tried in a special court that handled cases involving enslaved people accused of serious crimes, and he was convicted of inciting insurrection, a capital offense under South Carolina law. He was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that was supposed to be carried out within weeks. But the execution was delayed and then commuted to life imprisonment in chains, following intervention by various parties who argued that executing Jabari would make him a martyr and might inspire further resistance, whereas keeping him alive, but completely contained, would demonstrate that resistance was futile. This reasoning reflected the authorities' recognition that Jabari had become a symbol, and that how they handled him would send messages to the broader enslaved population about the consequences of resistance and about whether such resistance could be successful. Jabari spent the final 3 years of his life, from mid-1843 until his death in early 1846, IMPRISON, in a Charleston jail where he was kept in chains, and where his contact with other enslaved people was supposed to be prevented. But even in these constrained circumstances, Jabari continued his resistance work in the forms that remained available to him. He gave interviews to visiting abolitionists who managed to meet with him, providing detailed accounts of his life before enslavement, of the Middle Passage, and of his resistance activities in South Carolina. Some of these interviews were transcribed and published in abolitionist newspapers in the North, making Jabari's story known to people working to end slavery and providing evidence that contradicted pro-slavery claims about Africans being inferior or about enslaved people accepting their condition. Jabari also continued writing in Arabic, producing a manuscript that documented his experiences and that preserved his knowledge about African history and Islamic traditions. This manuscript was confiscated by authorities after his death and was apparently destroyed because of its potential to inspire resistance, but references to it in various documents confirm its existence and suggest what it contained. Jabari died in February 1846 at age 40 or 41, according to death records that listed the cause as fever, though there was speculation that his death was hastened by the brutal conditions of his imprisonment and possibly by deliberate neglect or by violence that authorities covered up. His death was barely noted in Charleston newspapers, which published brief notices identifying him only as an enslaved prisoner who had been convicted of inciting insurrection, with no mention of his background or of his resistance activities. This minimal coverage reflected the authorities' desire to suppress Jabari's story and to prevent him from being remembered as a hero or martyr by the enslaved population. But Jabari's memory was preserved in the oral traditions of enslaved communities in South Carolina and beyond, passed down through families and through informal networks, as the story of an African prince who had refused to accept enslavement and who had organized resistance until his death. These oral traditions kept knowledge of Jabari alive even when official records tried to erase him, and they eventually became the basis for historical research in the 20th and 21st centuries that would recover his full story and recognize its significance. The deliberate suppression of Jabari's story by American authorities was systematic and reflected their understanding that his example was dangerous to slavery stability. Official records that mentioned Jabari were classified or were destroyed, including court documents from his trials, plantation records that documented his arrival and sale, and correspondence about him between plantation owners and government officials. Newspapers that had published brief notices about his escape attempts or his conviction were later purged from some archives, with issues mentioning him going missing in ways that suggested deliberate removal. And former slaveholders and their descendants in South Carolina actively worked to suppress knowledge of Jabari in the decades after his death, refusing to discuss him and discouraging historical research that might recover his story. This suppression was motivated by recognition that Jabari's story contradicted multiple pillars of pro-slavery ideology: the claim that Africans were primitive people without sophisticated cultures, the claim that enslavement benefited Africans by exposing them to Christian civilization, and the claim that enslaved people generally accepted their condition rather than resisting it. Jabari's documented existence as an educated African royal who organized extensive resistance and who maintained literacy and cultural practices contradicted all these claims and demonstrated that the racist justifications for slavery were lies. The recovery of Jabari's story began in the 1960s when historians and activists researching resistance to slavery started finding fragmentary references to him in various archives, including in abolitionist newspapers, in letters between plantation owners, in court records that had escaped destruction, and in the oral histories of African American families that had preserved knowledge about him across generations. The initial discoveries were limited and left many questions unanswered about Jabari's background and activities, but they established that he was a real person and that he had organized significant resistance. Over subsequent decades, additional research expanded the documentation, including discovery of his Arabic letters in northern archives, where they had been preserved by the free black Muslims who had corresponded with him, discovery of references to him in South Carolina government records that documented efforts to suppress his story, and interviews with elderly African Americans whose great-grandparents had been enslaved in South Carolina and who had heard stories about Jabari. By the 2000s, enough evidence had been accumulated to reconstruct the basic outline of Jabari's life and to recognize his significance as someone who represented continuities between African resistance to slavery and resistance by enslaved people in America. The significance of Jabari's African royal background and his education extends beyond his individual story to challenge fundamental assumptions about African societies and about the people who were enslaved and brought to America. Jabari represented sophisticated African political systems that Europeans and Americans preferred to deny existed because acknowledging African civilization would have undermined justifications for slavery based on claims about African inferiority. His literacy in Arabic and his knowledge of Islamic scholarship demonstrated that many enslaved Africans came from literate cultures with long intellectual traditions, contradicting images of Africans as savages who needed European civilization. his leadership abilities, and his capacity to organize complex resistance operations demonstrated that enslaved people possessed exactly the qualities of intelligence, initiative, and strategic thinking that slaveholders claimed they lacked. And his refusal to accept enslavement, despite facing overwhelming power, and despite enduring brutal punishment, demonstrated that resistance was not futile or irrational, but was a rational response to injustice and was maintained by people who valued freedom more than they feared death. The question of how representative Jabari was of the broader enslaved population is important for understanding both his individual significance and the broader dynamics of slavery and resistance. Jabari was extraordinary in his specific background as African royalty and in his high level of education, and most enslaved people did not possess these particular advantages. But Jabari was representative in his resistance to enslavement, in his efforts to preserve African culture and identity, in his commitment to literacy and education as tools of resistance, and in his understanding that freedom required collective action rather than just individual escape. Many enslaved people organized resistance, maintained African cultural practices, taught literacy secretly, and refused to accept the dehumanization that slavery attempted to impose. Jabari's story is valuable partly because it documents these widespread patterns of resistance through the life of someone who was unusually well documented, providing evidence about practices and attitudes that were common, but that are often poorly recorded in historical sources that were created by slaveholders who had every reason to minimize or deny resistance. The connection between Jabari's Islamic faith and his resistance activities highlights an aspect of slavery's history that mainstream American narratives have often minimized or ignored. Many enslaved Africans, particularly those from regions of West Africa, where Islam had been established for centuries, were Muslim and maintained their faith through slavery, despite enormous pressure to convert to Christianity. These Muslim enslaved people sometimes possessed literacy in Arabic, sometimes maintained connections with free black Muslim communities in American cities, and sometimes used Islamic practices and identities as forms of resistance to slavery's cultural domination. Jabari's case documented these patterns and demonstrated that Islam was an important part of African American history from the earliest period of enslavement, not just a recent phenomenon. But this aspect of slavery's history was suppressed partly because acknowledging Muslim enslaved people challenged narratives about slavery being a mission to bring Christianity to African heathens, and partly because after September 11, 2001, acknowledging Islamic presence in African American history became politically uncomfortable in ways that led to continued minimization of Muslim enslaved people's stories. What lessons should we take from Jabari Mansa's forbidden story? That enslaved Africans came from sophisticated societies with their own political systems, educational traditions, and cultural achievements that racist ideology tried to deny and erase. That resistance to slavery was constant, organized, and strategic rather than rare or impulsive. That literacy and education were powerful tools of resistance that enslaved people pursued despite laws prohibiting education and despite severe punishment for being caught. That African cultural practices and identities were maintained through slavery despite all efforts to eliminate them. That enslaved people built extensive networks of communication and mutual support that connected communities across plantations and regions. That American authorities recognized how dangerous the truth about people like Jabari was to slavery's stability and worked systematically to suppress their stories. And that historical erasure is never complete because oral traditions preserve knowledge that official records tried to destroy, and because eventually researchers committed to truth can recover stories that power tried to bury. Remember Jabari Mansa, captured in West Africa in 1838, transported across the Atlantic in conditions that killed nearly half the people who suffered the Middle Passage with him, enslaved on South Carolina plantations, where he taught literacy in Arabic and organized 3 major escape attempts involving over 200 people, imprisoned for 3 years before dying at approximately age 41, and then systematically erased from official records because his story contradicted too many lies that slavery depended upon. Remember that he was an African king's son, educated in multiple languages and in Islamic scholarship, who understood political organization and resistance in ways that terrified slaveholders. Remember that he taught hundreds of enslaved people to read and write in Arabic in secret schools that operated beneath white awareness. Remember that he maintained correspondence with free black Muslims in northern cities using networks that predated the Underground Railroad. Remember that he preserved African historical memory and cultural practices in ways that challenged every racist assumption about Africans being inferior. Remember that American authorities tried to erase him completely from history, destroying records and suppressing his story for over 150 years. And remember that despite this systematic erasure, his story survived in oral traditions and was eventually recovered by historians who refused to accept official narratives that denied resistance and that minimized enslaved people's intelligence, education, and determination to be free. What do you think about the systematic suppression of Jabari's story and about why authorities worked so hard to erase him from history? Do you think his background as African royalty should make his resistance more remarkable, or should we recognize that all resistance to slavery was remarkable regardless of people's background? How should we understand the role of African Islam in slavery's history, given that mainstream narratives have often ignored Muslim enslaved people? And what does Jabari's story tell us about the need to be skeptical of official historical records that were created by people with interests in concealing truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If Jabari's forbidden story challenged your understanding of enslaved people's backgrounds and capabilities, and demonstrated how much truth was deliberately erased from American history, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to recovering the stories that America tried to bury, to honoring the people whose resistance was too dangerous to be acknowledged, and to ensuring that historical erasure ultimately fails because truth finds a way to survive. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that enslaved Africans came from sophisticated civilizations, that many possessed education and literacy, that they organized extensive resistance networks, and that American authorities recognized how dangerous these truths were to slavery's stability. Jabari Mansa was erased from official history for 150 years. Now you know his forbidden story. Remember him, honor him, and understand that he represents countless others whose stories remain buried, but whose resistance was real, and whose refusal to accept slavery shaped American history, whether that history acknowledges them or not. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that every erased story deserves to be recovered, every suppressed truth deserves to be told, and every person who resisted slavery deserves to be remembered as the hero they were. Remember Jabari Mansa. Remember the forbidden story America tried to erase forever.